The deception of Pearl Harbor. In the Pacific Theater, the stirrings of World War II actually began years before. China had allowed Japan to drill for oil in several provinces, because Standard Oil's price for kerosene was too high. Through contacts in the Chinese government, Standard Oil had been able to keep anyone from drilling, until the Japanese came and developed huge fields. Standard Oil pushed them out, but the Japanese vowed to return, even going as far as saying that they would seize China to recover their oil investments. When the Japanese invaded China in the 1930s, one of their first acts was to destroy Standard Oil property, because they had been responsible for their ouster. In 1931, Henry L. Stimson, the Secretary of State, a Rockefeller lawyer and agent, met with President Herbert Hoover, on behalf of the Illuminati, to make a deal. The international bankers promised to end the Depression if Hoover would declare war on Japan, and send in the military to protect Standard Oil property. Even though Hoover accommodated the bankers in many cases, this was one deal that he refused. So Stimson pitched the idea to Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who has a dozen U.S. presidents in his family tree, who was indebted to them because of his philanthropic operation at Georgia's Warm Springs. Roosevelt was born at Hyde Park, New York, in 1882. He graduated from Harvard, received a law degree from Columbia Law School, and in 1910, was elected to the New York State Senate, re-elected in 1912. He was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy by Wilson in 1913, on orders from Colonel House. According to House biographer Arthur D. Houghton Smith, Colonel House picked Roosevelt as a natural candidate for the presidency long before any other responsible politician. In the 1920 presidential election, Roosevelt was James Cox's running mate, but the Democratic team suffered from the mistakes of the Wilson administration, and lost miserably to the Harding-Coolidge ticket. Roosevelt later became a two-term governor of New York. After the 1932 Democratic Convention in Chicago, where Roosevelt became the party's nominee, he met with Colonel House at his Massachusetts home. House told another biographer, Charles Seymour, in 1938, "I was close to the movement that nominated Roosevelt. He has given me a free hand in advising Secretary of State, Cordell, Hull. All the ambassadors have reported to me frequently." The Illuminati put all their political power behind Roosevelt to get him elected, and in 1940, Roosevelt appointed Stimson, a CFR member, to the post of Secretary of War, even though he was a Republican. House, who was 75 years old, didn't become Roosevelt's alter ego. That role was filled by another Wilson advisor, Bernard Baruch, who became the liaison between Roosevelt and the bankers. FDR's uncle, Frederick Delano, was a member of the Federal Reserve Board, and in 1925, became the chairman of the League of Nations Committee. In 1934, he was appointed as chairman of the National Resources Planning Board, and in 1936, became chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank in Richmond, Virginia. Roosevelt was a 32nd-degree Mason, a Knight Templar, and a member of the Shrine. He is a direct descendant of socialist Clinton B. Roosevelt, the New York assemblyman who wrote The Science of Government founded in Natural Law, where he revealed a plan for world government. Clinton Roosevelt and Horace Greeley, founder and owner of the New York Tribune and New Yorker magazine, were the pioneers of social engineering research. In the February 1953 edition of the Empire State Mason, the official publication of the Grand Lodge of New York, the claim was made that if one world government ever came about, FDR should get much of the credit. In 1932, Major General Smedley Butler of the U.S. Marine Corps was approached by Grayson Mallet Provost Murphy, a director of Guarantee Trust, Robert S. Clark, a banker who inherited a fortune from the founder of the Singer Sewing Machine Company, and John W. Davis, a 1924 presidential candidate, who was an attorney for J.P. Morgan, with a plan to lead a revolution to overthrow the government and establish a fascist dictatorship. Butler was to seize the White House with a private army of 500,000 veterans, hold Franklin Roosevelt prisoner, and get rid of him if he refused to serve as their puppet in a dictatorship they planned to impose and control. Butler chose to expose the plot, rather than lead it, supposedly because of his patriotism. Or was it because he recognized their true aim, which was for Roosevelt to impose a dictatorship during a national emergency, so the government could take complete control? Butler is on record as having said, "War was largely a matter of money. Bankers lend money to foreign countries and when they cannot repay, the president sends Marines to get it." When the planned revolt didn't materialize, other plans were developed. Francis Perkins, Secretary of Labor, reported, at the first meeting of the cabinet after the president took office in 1933, the financier and advisor to Roosevelt, Bernard Baruch, and Baruch's friend, General Hugh Johnson, who was to become the head of the National Recovery Administration, came in with a copy of a book by Gentile, the Italian fascist theoretician, for each member of the cabinet, and we all read it with care. Future plans called for the government to be moved towards fascism, and government control without a revolution. They decided that the best method was through war, and Jim Farley, Roosevelt's postmaster general, said that during the second cabinet meeting in 1933, the new president again turned to the possibility of war in Japan. General Johnson wrote, "I know of no well-informed Washington observer who isn't convinced that, if Mr. Roosevelt is elected, in 1940, he will drag us into war at the first opportunity, and that, if none presents itself, he will make one. Roosevelt wanted Japan to withdraw, not only from Indochina, but also China, Manchuria. To enforce his demands, he froze all Japanese assets in this country, and cancelled a 1911 commercial treaty. He had their fuel supplies cut and placed an embargo on 11 raw materials which were necessary for their military. In December 1939, this was extended to light steel. In England, Winston Churchill, and later the Dutch government, followed suit. Former President Herbert Hoover observed the various political manipulations, and said in August 1941, "The American people should insistently demand that Congress put a stop to step-by-step projection of the United States into undeclared war." On September 28, 1940, Japan, Germany, and Italy signed the Tripartite Treaty, which declared that if any of the three were attacked, all three had to respond. So if Japan attacked the US, and the US would declare war against Japan, they would also be at war with Germany and Italy. In October 1940, part of FDR's strategy to push Japan into committing an overt act of war was to move America's Pacific Fleet out of California and have it anchored at Pearl Harbor. Admiral James Richardson, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, expressed to Roosevelt his strong opposition to putting the fleet in harm's way. He was relieved of his command. Richardson later quoted Roosevelt as saying, "Sooner or later the Japanese will commit an overt act against the United States and the nation will be willing to enter the war." Roosevelt and Churchill had already been working on a plan to get America to enter the war in Europe. After the German ship Bismarck sank the British ship, known as the Hood, Churchill suggested in April 1941 that an American warship should find the Prince Eugene, the Bismarck's escort ship, then draw her fire, thus providing the incident for which the United States would be so thankful, i.e., bring her into war. While Roosevelt planned for such a provocation in the Atlantic, Hitler told his naval commanders in July 1941 to avoid confrontation with the United States while his Russian campaign was in progress. Joseph C. Grew used his post as the U.S. ambassador to Japan to encourage the Japanese to enter a state of military preparedness. They were shipped steel scrap from the entire 6th Avenue Elevator Railroad of New York. The Institute of Pacific Relations, through a $2 million grant, funded communist spies who were to help induce the Japanese to strike back at the United States. Since then, it has become common knowledge that the attack was not the surprise it was claimed to be. On January 27, 1941, Grew sent a telegram to the Secretary of State to report the following. "The Peruvian minister has informed a member of my staff that he heard from many sources, including a Japanese source, that, in the event of trouble breaking out between the United States and Japan, the Japanese intended to make a surprise attack against Pearl Harbor." Source, U.S. Department of State, Publication 1983, Peace and War, United States Foreign Policy, 1931-1941. Washington, D.C., U.S., Government Printing Office, 1943, pages 617-618. In August 1941, Congressman Martin Dies, chairman of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, collected evidence that the Japanese were planning to attack Pearl Harbor. The committee was in possession of a strategic map, prepared by the Japanese Imperial Military Intelligence Department that clearly indicated their plans to attack Pearl Harbor. Dies was told not to go public with his information. An Army intelligence officer in the Far East discovered the plan for the Pearl Harbor attack, and prior to the attack, sent 3 separate messages to Washington detailing the plan. Soviet agent Richard Sorge told the Russian government in October 1941 that the Japanese intend to attack Pearl Harbor in the next 60 days, and received a response from his superiors that the information had been passed on to President Roosevelt. Dushko Popov, a British double agent, received information from Germany about Japan's plans, and passed the information on to Washington. It was never acted on. As early as 1944, presidential candidate, New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey, said that Roosevelt knew about the attack on Pearl Harbor before it happened. In documents declassified by the National Security Agency in 1981, America had broken the blue, diplomatic, and purple, naval, secret codes of the Japanese, knew all the details of the attack, and the whereabouts of the Japanese fleet. From September 1941 until the attack itself, all Japanese communications had been intercepted and decoded by American intelligence, and indicated an impending attack on Pearl Harbor. One transmission, from a fake weather report broadcast on a Japanese shortwave station, contained the words Higashi no kaze ame, which means east wind, rain, which the Americans already knew was the Japanese code for war with the United States. Top military officials denied that the wind's message existed and attempted to destroy all traces of its receipt. Late in November 1941, the following order was sent out to all U.S. military commanders. The United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. According to Secretary of War Stimson, this order came directly from Roosevelt. According to Stimson's diary, 9 people in the War Cabinet, all the military people, knew about FDR's plan of provocation. The State Department knew on November 20th that a naval force, which included 4 of the largest Japanese aircraft carriers, were heading towards Hawaii, and this information was passed on to Pearl Harbor on November 27th. However, the American base in Hawaii was not given this information. 3 days before the attack, Australian intelligence spotted the Japanese fleet heading for Hawaii. They sent a warning to Washington, but it was dismissed by Roosevelt, who said it was a politically motivated rumor circulated by the Republicans. On December 1, 1941, the head of the Far East Division of U.S. Naval Intelligence wrote in his report to head of the Pacific Fleet, "War between the United States and Japan will begin in the nearest future." The report never made it to the commander's desk, because it had been accidentally detained by his superiors. Early in December, Army intelligence knew that the diplomats at the Japanese embassy in Washington had been ordered to destroy all codes, and to return to Japan. Washington also knew that Japan had ordered all of its merchant ships home, because they would be needed to transport soldiers and supplies for the war. On December 5, Colonel Sadler from U.S. Military Communications transmitted the following telegram to his superiors, based on information he had received. "War with Japan will begin immediately. Exclude all possibility of a second Port Arthur." This telegram never got to its destination. In 1932, the U.S. Navy had conducted tests at Pearl Harbor which indicated that it was vulnerable to an attack from 60 miles away without being able to detect it. Admiral J.O. Richardson, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, wanted the fleet withdrawn to the west coast of the United States, because they were inadequately manned for war, and because the area was too exposed. It was not done. In January 1941, Richardson was relieved of his command. It was later revealed that Roosevelt wanted him to create a naval blockade around Japan, to provoke them into a response, so the United States could declare war. He refused to do it, saying it was an act of war. Besides knowing about the security weaknesses at the base in Pearl Harbor, and having previous knowledge about the impending attack, Roosevelt guaranteed a slaughter by ordering that the planes be grouped in circles, with their propellers facing inward, because he claimed that he wanted to protect them against acts of sabotage. Rear Admiral Robert A. Theobald, USN, retired, author of The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, and Colonel Curtis B. Dahl, the son-in-law of FDR, in an interview with Anthony Hilder for his book Warlords of Washington, admitted that they knew about the Pearl Harbor attack before it occurred. Theobald, the commander of all the destroyers at Pearl Harbor, said in his book that Roosevelt knew about the attack 21 hours before it happened. So the result of this positioning of the aircraft made it difficult for them to get out of the circle and up in the air, because they didn't have a reverse gear. Theobald wrote, "An incontestable fact in the true history of Pearl Harbor is the repeated withholding from Admiral Kimmel and General Walter C. Short, Navy and Army Command in Pearl Harbor, of supremely important military information. There's never been a case in history when a commander was not informed that his country will be at war within a few hours and that his forces will most likely become the first object of attack at sunrise." Theobald also cited the testimony of Admiral Harold Stark, head of Navy headquarters in Washington, who did not reveal Japan's de facto declaration of war to Admiral Kimmel, and said he was acting on orders from a higher authority, referring to Roosevelt, because Marshall did not outrank Stark. Marshall merely passed on the Roosevelt directive of December 4, which said that no communications could be sent to Pearl Harbor, unless it was cleared by Marshall. On November 26, 1941, Roosevelt had sent an ultimatum, insisting that the Japanese withdraw all their troops. He refused any negotiations with Prince Konoye, the Japanese Prime Minister, even though Joseph Grew, CFR member, and Rockefeller agent, the ambassador to Japan, said that such a meeting would prevent war with the Japanese. The Japanese response from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy, encrypted in the Purple Code, was intercepted by the Navy, decoded, and given to Roosevelt on the evening of December 6. The 13-point communiqué revealed that because of the intense pressure of the economic sanctions, diplomatic relations with the United States were being terminated at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Sunday, December 7. For all intents and purposes, this was a declaration of war, and upon reading it, Roosevelt said, "This means war." It was not passed on to Pearl Harbor Command, and it was at that time that the attack began. While FDR was pushing Japan into drawing first blood, he told the American public in his famous campaign statement of 1940, "While I am talking to you mothers and fathers, I give you one more assurance. I have said this before, and I shall say it again and again and again. "Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." Then he said later that he wouldn't send our boys to war unless we were attacked. Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum worked for Naval Intelligence in Washington and was the communications routing officer for FDR. All the intercepted Japanese messages would go to McCollum, who would then route them to Roosevelt. In October 1940, he wrote a memo which contained the basis for FDR's plan for provoking the Japanese into attacking at Pearl Harbor. It was given to two of Roosevelt's closest advisors. The memorandum revealed his sentiments that it was inevitable that Japan and America were going to war, and that Germany was going to be a threat to America's security. He said that America had to go to war, but he also understood that public opinion was against that. So public opinion had to be swayed, and Japan had to be provoked into attacking America. He named 8 specific suggestions for things that America should do to make Japan more hostile towards us, ultimately pushing them into attacking us. That would rally the country behind the war effort. Because he was born and raised in Japan, he said that he understood the Japanese mentality, and knew how they would react. This included moving the Pacific Fleet to Hawaii, and decimating Japan's economy with an embargo. McCollum said, "If you adopt these policies, the Japan will commit an overt act of war." Although there is no proof that FDR actually saw this memo, he ended up implementing all 8 of McCollum's points. The administration discovered that in 1941 a Japanese naval officer was working at the Japanese consulate in Honolulu under an assumed name. They followed him, and began to intercept his messages to Japan, which enabled the Japanese to develop a timetable for the attack, and even bomb plots. They never stopped him, and it enabled the Japanese to prepare themselves for an attack against us. Fleet Admiral Halsey wrote, "Our intelligence data spoke of a likely attack by Japan on the Philippines or the Dutch East Indies. Although Pearl Harbor wasn't excluded from discussion, everything relayed to us pointed to other objects of attack. If we had known that the Japanese were continually collecting detailed information about the exact location and movements of our warships in Pearl Harbor, which is made clear by intercepted reports, we naturally would have concentrated our efforts on preparations to repel an attack on Pearl Harbor." Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, after meeting with the Roosevelt administration on November 25, 1941, wrote in his diary, "The discussion was about how we should maneuver to force the Japanese to fire the first shot, while not exposing ourselves to too great a danger. This will be a difficult task." Admiral Husband E. Kimmel wrote in his memoirs, "It was part of Roosevelt's plan that no warning be sent to the Hawaiian Islands. Our leaders in Washington, who deliberately didn't inform our forces in Pearl Harbor, cannot be justified in any way. The Pearl Harbor Command wasn't informed at all about the American note of November 26, 1941, delivered to the Japanese ambassador, which practically excluded further negotiations and made war in the Pacific inevitable. The Army and Navy Command in the Hawaiian Islands received not even a hint about intercepted and deciphered Japanese telegrams which were forwarded to concerned parties in Washington on the 6th and 7th of December, 1941." The Pacific Fleet had consisted of 9 battleships, 3 aircraft cruisers, and some smaller ships. The aircraft carriers, and the smaller, more mobile ships, were moved prior to the attack, because Roosevelt knew they would be needed for a war at sea. On November 28, Fleet Admiral William F. Halsey, under Kimmel's command, sailed to Wake Island with the carrier Enterprise, 3 heavy destroyers and 9 small destroyers. And on December 5, the Lexington, 3 heavy cruisers and 5 destroyers were sent to Midway, and the Saratoga went to the Pacific coast. The other battleships were considered dispensable, because they had been produced during and prior to World War I, and were viewed as old and obsolete. They were to be sacrificed. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, instead of attacking Russia, as they originally intended to do. The sneak attack gave Roosevelt a reason to direct the full force of America's military might against Japan. The next day, Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on Japan. "We don't like it and we didn't want to get in it, but we are in it and we're going to fight it with everything we've got." On January 1, 1942, the 25 Allied nations who went to war against Germany and Japan signed a declaration by the United Nations, which indicated that no one nation would sign a separate armistice, and General Douglas MacArthur was appointed as the United Nations Commander of the South Pacific, becoming the Commander-in-Chief of all armed forces in the Pacific Theater. The attack on Pearl Harbor resulted in the deaths of 2,341 American soldiers, and 2,233 more were injured or missing. 18 ships, including 8 battleships, 2 destroyers, 2 squadron minesweepers, were sunk or heavily damaged, and 177 planes were destroyed. All of this, just to create an anti-Japanese sentiment in the country, and justify American action against Japan. General George C. Marshall, Supreme Commander of the U.S. Army, and Admiral Harold R. Stark, Supreme Commander of the U.S. Navy, in Washington, testified that the message about the attack was not forwarded to Kimmel and Short because the Hawaiian base had received so many intercepted Japanese messages that another one would have confused them. In truth, Marshall sat on the information for 15 hours because he didn't want anything to interfere with attack. The message was sent after the attack started. Internal Army and Navy inquiries in 1944 found Kimmel and Short derelict of duty, but the truth was not revealed to the public. 2 weeks before the attack, on November 23, Kimmel had sent nearly 100 warships from the Pacific Fleet to what turned out to be the exact location where Japan planned to launch their attack. Unquestionably, he was looking to prevent the possibility of a sneak attack. When the administration learned of his actions, he was criticized for complicating the situation. 11 days after the attack, the Roberts Commission, headed by Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts, made scapegoats of Kimmel and Short, who were denied open hearings, publicly ruined, and forced to retire. Short died in 1949, and Kimmel died in 1968. The most incredible of the 8 investigations was a joint House-Senate investigation that echoed the Roberts Commission. Both Marshall and Stark testified that they couldn't remember where they were the night the declaration of war had come in. A close friend of Frank Knox, Secretary of the Navy, later said that Knox, Stark, and Marshall spent most of that night with Roosevelt in the White House, waiting for the bombing to begin, so they could enter the war. According to historian John Toland, Marshall told his top officers, "Gentlemen, this goes to the grave with us." In 1995, a Department of Defense study concluded that Army and Navy officials in Washington were privy to intercepted Japanese diplomatic communications, which provided crucial confirmation of the imminence of war. The full extent of the deception came to the forefront with the publishing of the book Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor by Robert B. Stinnett, a retired Oakland Tribune photographer who served in the Pacific during World War II. After retirement, he began his investigation by interviewing former American military communications personnel and filing Freedom of Information requests with the National Security Agency. For 17 years he gleaned through volumes of previously classified messages which had been intercepted from the Japanese. Stinnett discovered that on November 25, 1941, Japan's Admiral Yamamoto dispatched a radio message to the group of warships that would be used to attack Pearl Harbor. It read, in part, "The task force, keeping its movements strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft, shall advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostilities shall attack the main force of the United States fleet in Hawaii and deal it a mortal blow." From November 17 to 25, the U.S. Navy intercepted 83 messages that Yamamoto sent to his carriers. This Pearl Harbor scenario was a repeat of the American battleship Maine, which was sunk by a Spanish mine in the port of Havana in 1898. The rallying cry of "Remember the Maine" was used to stir up anti-Spanish hysteria in America to justify us declaring war on Spain. Years later, when the ship was examined, it was established that the hull had been blown out by an explosion from inside the ship. So what did World War II accomplish for the Illuminati? With the Japanese prepared to surrender in February 1945, the war was prolonged in order to destroy much of the industrial areas of Japan with a devastating air attack of incendiary atomic bombs. This allowed the ground to be cleared for the Illuminati to rebuild Japan with new industries so they could use cheap labor to flood the American market with cheaply manufactured goods. This would turn the United States into a nation that consumed more than it produced, creating unemployment and financial instability. As stated previously, on the European front, the war enabled the Russians to gain control of Eastern Europe, promoted communism, paved the way for the United Nations, and the creation of the Nation of Israel. At a cost of about $400 billion, the war raised our national debt to $220 billion, and pushed us deeper into the clutches of the Illuminati's international bankers. Because of all the intricate angles involved in this conflict, it would not be an understatement to say that World War II was probably the most costly event in American history. We may have won, but, in the long run, we lost.